I want to start by saying I know exactly where I made mistakes. I've gone over it enough times that I can see them clearly now. I don't say that to blame myself. The mistakes were small and reasonable, and I think most people would have made them. That's the thing about this kind of situation. It doesn't start with something obvious. It starts with something that makes sense. I was 24. I'd just ended a long relationship, and my best friend Carrie convinced me to do a road trip up the Pacific Coast Highway. No real plan, just 2 weeks, split costs on everything. When we got to a small coastal town in Northern California, we found an Airbnb listing for a private guest house. A small, separate structure behind a main house, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a little deck facing the trees. Affordable for the area. The host was a man named Thomas. Around 20 reviews, mostly positive, though only a couple from the past year. I noticed that. Didn't read much into it. We booked 2 nights. Thomas was waiting in the driveway when we arrived. That was the first thing. Not aggressively, just standing there, smiling, walked us through the guest house himself instead of leaving us to a lockbox. He was maybe late 50s, friendly, talked the entire time. He showed us how the shower worked because the hot water took a while. He pointed out a trail through the woods down to the beach. He told us we were welcome to use the fire pit behind the main house. He talked a lot about the area, the town's history, restaurant recommendations. By the time he left, I felt mildly exhausted from the conversation, but not alarmed. Some people are just chatty. Before he left, he mentioned he sometimes came out to the garden in the mornings, a small vegetable patch between the main house and the guest house, and that we might see him, and he didn't want us to be startled. We said that was fine. It registered somewhere, that detail, but I filed it away. We went to dinner, walked around town, came back around 10, sat on the deck with a bottle of wine. At some point, I noticed a light on in the main house, a room on the side facing the guest house, curtains half drawn. I couldn't see anyone in the window. We went inside around 11, locked the sliding glass door and the front door, and went to sleep. In the morning, Carrie was up before me. When I came out, she was standing by the sliding glass door looking at the deck. She asked if I'd gone outside during the night. I said no. She pointed. There was a white coffee mug sitting on the small table on the deck. We hadn't put it there. We'd had wine the night before, not coffee, and we'd used glasses from inside. The mug wasn't one I recognized from the guest house. I went out and picked it up. There was dried coffee residue at the bottom, not fresh. It had been there for a while. I stood on the deck holding it and tried to think. The most obvious explanation was that the mug had been there when we arrived, and neither of us had noticed. We hadn't been especially observant when we first settled in. We'd glanced at the deck and gone back inside. That was possible. Genuinely possible. But then I tried to picture us arriving the evening before, walking out briefly to look at the view, and not seeing a white mug sitting on a small table with nothing else on it. The table wasn't big. The mug wasn't small. I kept reconstructing that moment, and I couldn't make the mug invisible in it. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen counter, and Carrie and I looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then I said, "If it wasn't there when we arrived, someone put it there." She said, "Yeah." Neither of us said the next part out loud, which was that the deck was accessed only through the locked sliding glass door from inside the guest house, or from the side yard, which was open but ran directly alongside Thomas's property. We got dressed and walked to town for breakfast. On the way, I said it again. If that mug wasn't there yesterday, the only way it gets there is if someone came onto the deck during the night. Carrie said she knew. We talked about leaving. We'd had a long drive, we liked the location, we had one more night booked. We told each other we were probably overreacting, that the mug had probably just been there. We walked back in the afternoon and Thomas was in the garden. He looked up and waved, unhurried, like he'd been expecting us. Around 4, he knocked on the guest house door and asked if everything was okay. We said yes. Then he said he'd noticed we'd come back and just wanted to check in. I closed the door and stood in the kitchen thinking about that sentence. He'd noticed we'd come back. Not, "I heard you come in," or "I saw your car." He'd noticed we'd come back, past tense, deliberate. It meant he'd been watching the property closely enough to track our movements. He lived there, so that wasn't impossible. But it sat with me in a way I couldn't shake. I told Carrie quietly, standing close to her in the kitchen, keeping my voice low even though the door was closed. She said it was a weird thing to say. We agreed on that. That evening we stayed in. I checked both locks before we sat down, the front door and the sliding glass door, and then checked them again an hour later without really deciding to. We kept the lights on. We ate snacks, watched something on Carrie's laptop with the volume low, and went to bed earlier than we normally would have. I woke up around midnight. I don't know what woke me. Sometimes you just wake up. I lay still and listened, and then I heard it. A sound from the main room. Not from the deck, not from outside. From inside the guest house. Closer. A soft creak, the kind a floor makes when weight shifts on it. It stopped and didn't repeat. I didn't move. I lay there with my heart going fast and my breathing shallow, and I waited. The sound didn't come again. The room was dark. I could hear Carrie breathing in the other bed. I stayed still for a long time. Then, slowly, I got out of bed and moved to the doorway between the bedroom and the main room. I stood there and looked out. The curtains were thin and the outdoor light came through them. The room looked empty. Nothing moved. I stood there long enough that my eyes adjusted fully and I could see most of the room clearly. Nothing. I went to Carrie's bed and put my hand on her arm and said her name quietly. She woke up fast, looked at my face, and didn't ask questions. We sat on her bed in the dark and I whispered what I'd heard. She listened. We both listened. Nothing. The guest house was completely quiet. I picked up my phone and called 911. Not because I was certain someone was there. I wasn't. But we were two women alone in a detached structure on a property owned by a man we barely knew. We'd already found something on our locked deck that hadn't been there the night before, and I wasn't willing to wait for more certainty. I told the dispatcher our address and that I thought someone might have entered the guest house and that I was scared. 2 officers arrived in about 15 minutes. We let them in. They looked through the main room, the bathroom, the small closet. Nothing. The front door was locked. The sliding glass door was locked. No signs of entry. One of the officers looked at the front door and said, almost casually, that the type of lock on it could be operated from outside with the original key. He said it the way you'd mention something in passing. Not as an accusation, just information. I've thought about that moment a lot since. The way he said it. Factual, offhand, like he was just noting something about the hardware. I've wondered if he was trying to tell me something without being in a position to say it directly. I've wondered that more times than I can count. Because if the lock could be opened from outside with the original key, and Thomas had the original key, then a locked door wasn't the reassurance I'd thought it was when I checked it twice that evening. The officers went and knocked on the main house door. Thomas answered. They spoke for a few minutes. He looked over toward the guest house once. The conversation looked calm. They came back and told us Thomas had said he sometimes walked the property at night because of wildlife getting into the garden, and that he may have left the mug on the deck and forgotten it. They said there was no evidence of a crime and suggested we lock up and try to sleep. We did not sleep. We sat with every light in the guest house on and waited for it to get light outside. We didn't talk much. At 6 in the morning, we packed, left the key on the table, walked to the car, and drove to the next town without going near the main house. I left a review. Factual. The host was overly present throughout our stay. An unknown object appeared on our private deck overnight. We'd called the police. I said I wouldn't return. Thomas responded and said we'd had a lovely stay and he was sorry we'd felt uncomfortable. He didn't address a single specific thing I'd written. I reported the listing to Airbnb. A few weeks later, it was gone. I don't know why. They never told me. I think about what the officer said about the lock every time I check into a rental now. I bring a rubber door wedge and jam it under the handle before I sleep, even in hotels. I book places where the host doesn't live on the property. I read the negative reviews first. I don't know if Thomas came into that guest house. I don't know if he'd been doing it the whole time or only that night or not at all. I have no proof of anything. What I have is a mug I can't explain, a sentence about noticing we'd come back, a lock that wasn't as secure as I thought, and a floor that made a sound in the middle of the night. The not knowing is the part I haven't found a way to put down. I've tried to arrive at a version of events that closes it off neatly, and I can't. Some version of that night is still open. It probably always will be.